Hello everyone. Welcome to one of the roundtables held by various clusters at Nickel and Dime. For today's roundtable, we have clustered international relations and policy with us. So for today, we'll be discussing about sports washing from an international aspect. Sports washing in general implies how nation states use sports to improve their reputation and uh, public image in their international circles. So today we have Sagara, Rakshan, Aditi, Tanvee, Nachiket, and Wynnona and I will be moderating this roundtable. Just a general disclaimer: the views put forward today, uh, they are just uh, they are the columnists' views only, and they do not represent the institution they are affiliated with or the center. So with this, I'll be posing the first question. So is sports washing a new or contemporary phenomena? So whoever wants to go, please unmute yourself and speak.
Sagara, would you like to start?
Yeah. So, no, it's not. It's almost as old as the history of telecasted sports is. And I think specifically we can trace it back to the beginning of when sports began to be broadcasted, either as through radio or through other forms of communication, later television, and now on the internet. So if you look at some of the earliest instances of sports washing, I think can be traced back to the 1920s and 1930s. And that's when sports actually started to be televised to the rest of the world. First through the radio and then through television. So it's that connection between sports and the evolution of different forms of communication that actually allowed for these nations to access a much larger platform through the sports events they were hosting. So now they weren't just the sports events weren't just an opportunity to bring in their own teams and like just compete from the perspective of sports and nothing else, but it was also a platform for them to use it to hide whatever human rights abuses that the nation was carrying out and present a face of that nation to the rest of the world that is more palatable to the masses. Yeah.
Yes, Aditi, and then Tanvee.
Right. To continue what Sagra has already talked about, I think to actually illustrate how this concept is not a very new concept, but it has been going on for a very long time, I will take the example of the 1936 Olympics organized by Berlin, which was then ruled by Hitler, right? That was the Nazi Germany. And not only in 1936, but it was the Olympic Games being organized in that period was to be organized by all the Axis powers, which is Mussolini's Italy and Tokyo, right? So it was actually in 1936, the Axis powers had decided that in 1940, the Olympic Games is going to be organized by Tokyo, and in 1944, it's going to be organized by Mussolini's Italy. But then because of the World War II, the Olympic Games did not happen. But this goes on to show that just the concept of holding sports events in countries is used by leaders and dictators all across the world and has been used by dictators even before to showcase or to portray their country as a benevolent nation, right? That a nation that is in support of true sport, is in support of like sportsmanship, and is actually encouraging people, and is like just a country holding a sports event is representative of so much more than just that event happening. That it's more than just the identity of the leader, and that is how, that's just like another thing that is used by nations to strengthen their soft power, uh, which is why, and we now see this concept being reflected in the contemporary era, while we'll talk about that later in our roundtable, right? With examples such as Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, or even India in some manners with Indira Gandhi's rule. Thank you.
Yeah, so just adding on to that, I think reputational costs are much more valuable to authoritarian regimes than democracies, because the sheer fact that they have to put out an image, because everything that's been put out there by the regime itself is propaganda, right? So sports washing is a very interesting example of such propaganda. The debate on whether or not it's been successful, because Saudi Arabia and the UAE might be huge sporting patrons in the European clubs and other leagues, is, I think, up for debate. But I feel like the fact that sports washing is something as new as broadcasting, the amount of media attention that comes to these sporting events comes onto the country as well. So, I mean, it's really just, it's not new, but it's also very interesting to see how it transitions in the years to come by. For example, the 1936 Olympics that Aditi mentioned, if we compare that event to, say, the 2018 World Cup that Russia held, there are certain points that come across which are, it's interesting to really note how it has evolved over time to cater to these different needs that authoritarian regimes have now.
Would anyone else like to chime in? Okay, then let's move on to the next question. Yeah.
So the next question would be, do democracies need sports washing? How much and how often? Yeah, Nachiket.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring to attention the 1996 Atlanta Olympics that were held in United States. So there was a different kinds of sports washing that was happening when the US government tried to present a different sort of demographics by the maps they put out, the tour guides they did. So just going back to those Olympics, we find that the tour guides which were given to representatives of other nations or ambassadors that came from other nations, they removed the South Atlanta part, or which was heavily dominated by African American people, and it showed that how race also becomes a factor while when you held those events. So there was this sort of demographic anxiety of a different sort which was seen in the United States at that time, because and apart from that, just before the Olympics, when the bid happened like around 7 years ago, 1989, 1990, so heavy redevelopment projects or displacement projects happened, to remove particular areas of the map altogether. So this is a different kind of sports washing we see that only happens for the Olympics game which were to be held, or for a particular sporting event which are to be held, and these were motivated by racial reasons in the United States.
Continuing on what Nachiket was mentioning, even if a democracy may not have necessarily committed human rights abuses, there's still a lot of benefit that they can get from sports washing. As you mentioned, there's a racial element that comes in. And if you look back at the 2016 Rio Olympics, it was evident that they were trying to hide the extent of poverty that was happening in Brazil at the time. They were quite literally covering up areas where favelas were present, and they were building huge walls so that the visitors who were coming to see the Olympics, as well as the athletes themselves, couldn't see the actual very desperate conditions in which the actual citizens of Brazil were living in at the time. Democracies can still benefit from sports washing, regardless of whether or not they've committed human rights abuses. But then again, democracies are also not much less guilty of committing human rights abuses either. So overall, just it can give them the same kind of makeover that sports washing gives to authoritarian regimes, depending on like the specific time period in which the sports event is hosted. Now, the slight difference that I'd say that sports washing presents when you put it in the context of a democracy than an authoritarian regime is that, at least in the case of a democracy within the country, you'd be much more likely to see people still protesting the event and still trying to point out what the government is trying to hide by hosting this event, whereas you wouldn't see the same in an authoritarian regime. But even if that's happening within the country, as it did during the 2016 Olympics, there were huge protests against the hosting of the Olympics when the Brazilian population was suffering from extreme poverty. But still, the rest of the world that isn't as privy to these protests and the fact that they're happening, the rest of the world is still influenced by the sport as a whole. So yeah, it still definitely gives benefits to their democracies, but perhaps not to the same extent that it does for authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, I think just to sort of push back to that as well is that by definition, sports washing doesn't necessarily have to mean that you are, shrouding or hiding human rights abuses. It can be anything. Like it's a reputational cost. So for example, when India won its first gold in track in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, it was a big reputational boost for India, but it's not like India was actively pushing for a golden track. But now the sort of like boost that India has gotten, the boost that India's track and field, um, you know, um, careers have gotten is immense. So I feel like with sports washing, I think there's a very conscious element of the government or corporation or individual trying to push for this agenda. And I don't know if that's really relevant in the case of India, like I just said. So I do feel like it's very interesting because just to see like China following in on a close second with 38 gold medals in the Tokyo Olympics is insane because they are, using this platform to do so well in every single sport from like basketball to football to everything. And they're totally dominating it just close to the United States, right? So the push that they're portraying for China's global image, because it's a global event and it has a lot of audience, it has broadcasting, so much attention goes to that. So I think definitely I think the reputation aspect of it bears a heavy weight. But when it comes to democracies, I'm not too sure. I mean, not in my opinion, at least.
That makes sense. So everybody uses it to their advantage, but some people just need that advantage more. Some countries just need that more. Would anybody else like to chime in?
So with that, it begs us to ask a question: how insidious sports washing has been in the last decade, and why is it such a big concern?
Right. So, like it has been mentioned so far, sports washing is not a new thing. We've seen it happen in the 1928 FIFA World Cup with Italy. We've seen it happening with 1930 Olympics with Hitler. And it has always been used as a propaganda tool for a very long time. So why is there a need to talk about it right now in the past 10 years? It's because of how serious the issue has become in the recent years. So last month, it was confirmed that a 305 million bid has been approved by the Premier League, and that Saudi Arabia's public investment fund would take over 80% controlling share in English club. Now, Amnesty International has described that takeover as an extremely bitter blow for human rights defenders, and questions have been raised about the possibility of sports washing by Saudi Arabia itself. Now, we have defined sports washing as when a corrupt or a authoritarian regime uses sports to enhance its reputation. That's what exactly sports washing is. It's still a very new term, even though it's been happening for a very long time, right? It's been used by human rights defenders very recently. In the past few years, Saudi Arabia has emerged over and above its Middle Eastern neighbors in trying to paint a rosy picture of the country while prosecuting those for standing up for it, right? Like if you look at the last 2 years itself, the Gulf state has gone from hosting boxing matches, horse racing in wrestling, to now owning Newcastle, and is also preparing a Formula One race. All of this happens in the time period when Saudi Arabia was going through a tough time with the murder of a journalist in the American journalist within the state. Now, sports washing program all comes at a huge cost. In like they've spent about $1.5 billion just to cover up in the last 1 year. Now, Saudi Arabia's association with sport especially has become an integral and contentious part of the effort. But the takeover of Newcastle in United Kingdom has been the boldest move yet, placing it firmly on the world sporting stage and squarely. It has become quite a big issue right now. But again, like I said, sports washing has never been a new topic. And especially the last 10 years, Newcastle now joins Chelsea and Manchester City in the United Kingdom alone, whose owners have been linked to authoritarian governments in UAE or in Russia. And that is excluding the sponsorship deals that clubs like Arsenal has with Rwanda or other teams have with other authoritarian regimes. But owning a football club and other hosting events has become a huge step. Owning a high-profile European club itself also gives the regime more clout with the organizing club of FIFA and the whole game's governing body itself. Now, they proved useful when Russia successfully bid for the 2018 World Cup. The same goes for Qatar. It only happened once they took over PSG. Now, that was in 2010. And now 10 years later, we are seeing the entire build-up to a World Cup right now. Now, the biggest thing right now that everyone keeps saying is, fine, the buying a football club actually shines a light on your bad behavior and denies that sports washing actually exists. But this ignores the fact that a well-directed spotlight can bring significantly more positive than negative media coverage. And that aim is to achieve a net reputational benefit. And it's not to just erase it altogether. And that's what we've been seeing in Manchester City. And we're now witnessing it in Newcastle, is that the purchase and generous financing of football club, it actually results in an influential group of people becoming invested in the success of your project. Now, the general philosophy is that how do we know that sports washing has been successful? You can see various news articles about how people in Newcastle have been celebrating the Saudi Arabia's takeover of the team. And they say that if I get to celebrate our first trophy in decades, I won't care who was in charge of us, right? And that's the reality. It will be great. And that's the same for Manchester City, who won their first trophy in 2011. All the same for PSG, who have been trying to win a Champions Trophy the past 20 years now. And for them, that's all that matters, because that is how emotional the power of sports and how insidious effect of sports washing is. So there's much more to a mental space to consider a state of human rights abuse and euphoria of victory. And they are in many sense washed away. It is precisely why sports washing works so well, and why Saudi Arabia has been seeking to follow the examples of Abu Dhabi and Qatar and Russia and China. China currently owns 3 teams in the Premier League itself. Now, it's an integration that you see. So you are thinking about how people are going to talk about it. If you are a person living in London and you're a supporter of Arsenal, you're saying, I'm going to Emirates this way. If you're a supporter of Manchester City and you live in Manchester, you're saying, I'm going to the Etihad Stadium this week. And that's just sponsorship. Ownership of a club comes in a much more higher level, and it kind of creates an image that can get away with anything. It's been successfully done by Qatar. It's been successfully done by UAE. It's been successfully done by Russia, which we saw that in the 2018 World Cup. And now we're seeing that same thing happening with Saudi Arabia all over again. That is why it is there a need at this moment to talk about sports washing. The term sports washing as a whole, we need to flesh it out more. It's still a very new, it's not a new thing that has happened, but the concept of it, the word usage of it is still very, very nuanced. We've not really fleshed out what it means, but it is kind of clear that it is to burnish the reputation of serial human rights abusers, those who are also in the concept of capacity to corrupt. And it also, what it does is, within the country of UK or whichever country they're owning teams in, it kind of comes in the way of their democratic governance. People fall to it. For example, if I'm a supporter of Manchester City, and if my MP talks about why we should talk about the abuses done by Saudi Arabia or UAE, I wouldn't care. I would be like, no, my team is winning. And if you're going to talk about it, then I probably might not vote you in the next elections. I'll probably have someone who will make sure that my team keeps winning. That's how emotional sports is. That's how important sports is. And that's how good buying a team can mean for your reputation. So it's been happening a lot since 2010, and the trend is only going to continue. And we need to understand that unless and until, for example, the Russia World Cup, there was a lot of chatter before it, but it didn't really do anything. And after the World Cup, it just didn't matter. So that's why I felt like there is a relevance to talk about sports washing right now. And Yeah, that's pretty much it from my side. I will keep bringing my points in the other sections.
That was quite interesting. Nachiket, do you want to add something to it?
Yeah, so going back to the idea that, this famous quote by Eric Heiden, who was a professional ice skater, he said, "Sports and politics do not mix." So this idea has been like boosted by Olympic supporters and money makers, advertisement companies, that sports and politics do not mix. Like they have separated both of these arenas. But a recent trend has also emerged that where International Olympics Committee, if you're specifically focusing on Olympics, International Olympics Committee has been claimed that they are giving more weightage to what Freedom House would classify as authoritarian, partly free, or uh, despotic regimes in some ways. So, in fact, a greater analysis of the past decade and a half would reveal that in the bid processes itself, democracies have lost some of the interest. Like democracies are not coming forward to place their bids as often as democratic authoritarian regimes would come. So this whole idea then chimes in together with what benefit do they gain, as we have discussed. But more importantly, if we look at the cases where they are concentrated, you'll find that Central Asian space states, Middle Eastern states, and a few Eastern European states have also uh, come ahead in the bidding process as when compared to democratic regimes. So just to take one example, Belarus is in itself, in 2019 it hosted 100 international sporting events. So we cannot just overlook that, 100 international sporting events in just 1 year, and a country that has been under the leadership since the end of the Cold War, by a single ruler itself. Then there's the example of Turkmenistan, where Berdi Muhammadov, the leader itself, himself is very interested in sporting events. He has opened 200 sports complexes to train, to open something of a factory that is generally associated with the Chinese establishment, a factory of creating more and more athletes and Olympians. So these contemporary examples generally help us better relate with the concept as a whole itself, because otherwise it might feel like it's a very abstract, complex, very abstract concept which is not supported by examples, or so moving out from the Middle East itself, we'll find many examples if we need to look. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Nachiket. Sagara, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so one common thread I could find both in what Rakshan mentioned and Nachiket mentioned was that of financing. So Rakshan mentioned that you have Saudi Arabia throwing in billions of dollars into buying these football clubs and investing in sponsorships and etc. And even Nachiket mentioned that it is authoritarian regimes that bid the most for these sporting events. And that's one key reason why we have seen sports washing become so relevant and also so successful over the past decade, is the fact that over the past decade, we've seen, first of all, the 2009 financial crisis, which did hit especially the football arena very significantly, and more recently, the COVID crisis. So both of these crises have caused an extreme finance crunch in some of the world's major sporting events. And unfortunately, these big clubs and big players and big sporting events need big financiers. And at least in the context of football, those big financiers are oil-rich authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. So, which is why these nations have been able to exploit the kind of credit crunch that these clubs are facing to invest in them and give them the money that they need to survive these crises and flourish when almost all other clubs in their league are suffering. So if we were to look at the context of football over the past 2 years, ever since the COVID crisis began, you have seen both La Liga and the English Premier League really suffer because of the fact that they couldn't open up their stadiums to audience. They had to solely rely on revenues that they got from broadcasting their football matches. And even then they had costs of, ensuring that they could quarantine their players, etc., etc. And you had a situation where there were some clubs that had to sell off their players. There are clubs that simply couldn't afford to hire new players, even if their team was suffering really significantly. Personally, I'm a huge fan of FC Barcelona, and FC Barcelona star player Messi, that has been the one reason why so many people have followed that club. They had to let go of Messi simply because the rules of their contract just mentioned that they couldn't afford to keep Messi anymore and still remain solvent as a club, because that's the extent of the crisis they were facing as a result of COVID. And there comes in a country like Qatar, which is the country that finances PSG. They were able to afford Messi when no other club in the world was able to do so, because they had money from an oil-rich nation. So it is the fact that these authoritarian regimes are able to leverage the money that they have to invest in these sports events and these sports clubs, and in turn use them as a cover for their human rights abuses. That's one major reason why we can see sports washing become increasingly relevant over the past decade. Obviously, there's many cases beyond Middle East, and there's many cases beyond football that escape the realm of financing. But even if we look at the history of, say, the Olympics, there have been cases where there have been no other bidders for the Olympics other than a few countries. And even if those countries may be suffering some kind of backlash due to some recent political actions that they've taken, they still end up hosting these events simply because there's no other bidders. And these are the only countries that can afford to host these events. So financing, I think, is a major reason why we can see sports washing become so much more effective and so much more harmful over the past decade.
Okay. Tanvee, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so I think sort of to balance the narrative that's been going around in the discussion as well, I agree with what Sagara has said, that at its core is sports washing a financial addressing, because the past decade, Rakshan had pointed out that sports washing has become relevant. But in the past decade, you also have to understand that Europe hasn't been very financially prosperous in order to fund their own clubs. So the money, I mean, where does the money come from? I mean, if these clubs are millions of dollars over in their spending in debt, then it has to, I mean, it will come from an oil-rich country, because that's where the money will come from. And I think that's a very strategic way of looking at how they're investing in this. And but however, I'd also like to point out that in the past decade, like I said, like sports washing has been very congruent with the history of broadcasting. And I feel like my problem with the arguments that come across that, people will stop caring about it. But the fact is that, let's say that sports washing didn't exist, would these sports fans still care about human rights abuses? Because your subset of assessing, I think Rakshan had mentioned this, your subset of assessing if sports washing is successful is limited to a very certain demographic. But when we look at it, like, I think in today's age, no amount of washing is really gonna, take away the stains that these human rights abuses cause to a country's reputation. While a certain sect or a certain demographic might only care about their club winning, because like Rakshan said, sports is emotional. Your attachment is to your club, not to the funding behind the club, because that's behind the scene. You don't see it actively. You see your players, like Sagra mentioned, Messi being, not being there in Barcelona anymore. And that's what you see. You don't see the money that comes behind it. Where's the money coming from? And hence, like, it's very easy to hide behind a veil when it comes to sports washing. It is relevant, but I feel like I'm on the fence about it being successful, because there are reports. I mean, the fact that Amnesty had to like release a report on Saudi Arabia's purchase is a testimony to the fact that sports washing probably isn't that successful, because every single time a purchase happens, every single time a sponsorship deal comes through, there is a backlash to it. The very fact that we're talking about it, the very fact that we're debating about it, points out that sports washing, to an extent, has a pull in society or in broadcasting and sports. But at its core, I don't feel like there are, very powerful spillovers that we see today, no one is not talking about human rights abuses. Like Rakshan mentioned, after 2018, no one spoke about Russia. I don't think that's true. I feel like the conversation was pretty much alive throughout the World Cup. And even after that, we still know what Russia is doing. We still know what China is doing. China's in the news since the Uyghur Muslim crisis started. Saudi Arabia will stay in the news. Qatar will stay in the news. The fact that the funding's coming from there can't be detached from the fact that these are authoritarian regimes. But unfortunately, that's just how funding is working. So yeah, I think I just wanted to add that because number one, you have to keep in mind the demographic you're assessing to see if sports washing is successful. Number two, the very fact that we are having this discussion, the very fact that we have sources. We can't assume the media to be a passive actor. We can't assume people in these countries to be passive actors. Just because, for example, if a newspaper is being funded by an MNC, okay, they will be posting, I mean, they will be writing news which will not go against the MNC, even if they're not paying their laborers. But the fact remains that even if you're not seeing that in the newspaper, you know that it's still happening. I mean, we aren't passive. The media isn't passive. People watching sports aren't passive. Governments aren't passive. The world stage isn't passive. So I think it's very interesting to see how that balances out with like the arguments that have been put forth.
Rakshan, would you like to comment on Tanvee's argument?
So I had noted down some of the points, counter arguments that have been brought up. So the first one that comes up, this being more of a financial one than of a image building one. So one has to look back in history as to, was sports always like this? No, it started off with authoritarian regime puppet in the form of Roman Abramovich, who bought in Chelsea, who broke football at this moment that we are seeing in a situation. People cannot afford a particular player or a particular team based on what an authoritarian person's puppet has done over in the past decade, and buying a team, making sure that the level playing field is not level at all. That's the start of it. Football was not always like a player coming in from other player was never really bought in for more than 50 million or 10 million, 20 million. That was the limit before. Then you come in a Qatar money, which comes in from PSG, buys in a player for 222 million. That is the reason why no one else can afford it. That is the standard that has been set by these teams. It's because regulators have let in these teams and come like, fine, we need your money. So you give us the money and then you can go around destroying whatever the ethics of football is. Fine, it works. At this moment, it has created an atmosphere which makes sure that the lower teams cannot afford other teams. And it's not just me or anyone else talking about this. Premier League itself has been countering every single ownership deals in the past 2 decades as to why are these teams buying us? They're not only destroying us, but everything we stand for. So that's one argument. You have to look into the fact that it was them in the first place who made sure that this issue of no one else can afford it starts with. Other thing is, that's why Europe cannot afford it at this moment. So would fans not care if it was not there? The whole point of demographic, you only have to look into the city group. The Abu Dhabi royal family has bought not only just Manchester City in Europe, it has bought Melbourne City in Australia, it has bought New York City in America, it has bought Mumbai City in ISL. That's the level of demographic, right? And what has changed is that these were all teams of famous cities, but were not really winning. They had huge followings. They had huge problems with the clubs itself. They were like, fine, we have huge following, we assessed it now, but we're not really making much of it. They bought in these cities, and currently you see New York FC winning the league, you see Melbourne FC winning the league, and Mumbai FC, of course, won the ISL, I think this year or the previous year. So the demography is not just Europe. They have taken over all over the world and slowly happening, not just in football, but in other sports as well. Five out of the 22 races for F1 Formula One happens in the Middle East at this moment. But again, I understand the point of fans not caring about, but should regulators care about it or not? Amnesty International also talked about the UAE group when they bought about Manchester City. It still took over, and we're seeing the results right now. And 10, we're still seeing the Qatar World Cup happening. We also saw China being in discussion for the 2022 Winter Olympics, but we still know for a fact that it will go on. Qatar World Cup is not going to stop. These are the conversations, even though it's happening. Like I mentioned, it's not about completely eradicating human rights abuse. It's about creating that net balance between, okay, we will create human rights abuses, but as long as we do this, it will balance out pretty well. So that's the entire aim of sports washing that has happened in the previous few years. So, and also you have one main thing is like, does sports washing actually work or not? You only have to look into the aspect that how much effort these countries like Russia, Qatar, China, Saudi Arabia are putting into buying teams, into hosting Olympics, into hosting World Cups. The amount of corruption that allegations that Qatar has for hosting 2022 World Cup tracks to the fact that they really, really badly want to host the World Cup in 2022. And I'll tell you something. Hosting Olympics, hosting World Cup does not bring in money. It actually brings in more losses than anything else. Any of the Olympic villages that you look into, be it Rio, be it Beijing, be it any other Olympics that you've seen, results in losses, and all of them can compare to graveyards. That's how bad the situation is with regards to Olympics. So if you're not really making in money, then why are you hosting Olympics? Why do you want so badly to host World Cups? Same with, and it's not just hosting, it's about, someone mentioned about how China was, how many gold medals they won, and that's another status, how much we can win. And we've seen that with the 2014 Sochi Olympics. The Winter Olympics are scandaled with controversy about doping, state-sponsored doping, and there's a brilliant documentary in the form of Icarus, who actually wanted to see about doping in cycling, but accidentally stumbled upon how Putin was sponsoring the state-sponsored doping in Russia, which resulted in 34 gold medals for Russia. And that's the reason why I feel that sports washing is working. Since the 2014 Winter Olympics, Russia has been banned from sports. There's a very particular reason why you do not see their flag, why you do not see them, the national anthem being played, but they're still taking part in it. They're still part of hosting World Cups. They're still part of taking part in Olympics. They're still playing in Formula One. They're still playing in football. The only difference is they're not using their flag and not playing the national anthem. If Russia is indeed banned, why are this taking place in the first place? This should not be there at all. But the fact that they're there and the only difference is fine, we will not use their flag, we will not play the national anthem, points to the fact that sports washing is working. This allegation, them being banned, happened in 2014, 15, and 16. But they still ended up hosting the 2018 FIFA World Cup. They participated in the current Olympics. And with regards to Formula One, they're there every year. We just don't call it Russian Grand Prix, we just call it Sochi Grand Prix. So you using these loopholes little here and there, it matters, right? Same with Newcastle's thing. So when it comes about why have regulators allowed Saudi Arabia to buy or UAE to buy these teams? It's simple. Saudi Arabia and UAE have bought in weapons from UK worth 20 million for sponsoring the war in Yemen. They are in profit for that. So yeah, they're still happening, and we talk about it. And like I said, Amnesty has, I think it was a human rights leader who said that, yeah, Amnesty keeps bringing the word sports washing whenever possible more than us. So it's been happening for a very long time. Amnesty has been writing reports on it for a very long time. Jamal Khashoggi's wife herself has been advocating for why Saudi Arabia should not buy Newcastle as a front. But it still happens. The fact that it still happens and net balances reputation points to the fact that even though they are in news, it will still continue to happen. Yeah, that's it from me.
Okay, so Aditi, would you like to go now?
Yeah, even my point was quite similar to what Rakshan had said. And it was in response to what Tanvee was saying about how the world, the media, the people are not passive. I mean, even though we're having a conversation about it, even though the UN talks about it, even though all the media houses across the world talk about it, there's no real implementation. Like the situation of the Uyghur Muslims in China currently is just preposterous, and there's no action taken, even by the strongest international organization of the world, which is the United Nations, right? Like the United Nations is criticized heavily for being a non-effective organization. They only pass resolutions, but there's no real action taking place with respect to either China or even if we look at the UN like the UN has failed at dealing with so many human rights abuses, whether that be in countries like in Africa or the Rwandan genocide and stuff like that, right? So my response to that was very similar to Rakshan, like I've already said. And I do think that the world is passive. And even though we're having a conversation, it only stays on paper. And these countries get away with abusing human rights. That's all. Thank you.
Sagra, you have raised your hand. Would you like to go next?
Yeah, so just like to summarize both what Rakshan and Aditi said and what Tanvee mentioned, I agree with all of them. So at least from Tanvee's perspective, I agree that it may not be as effective from keeping news media from covering these human rights abuses, because in a way it could have the reverse effect where you're hosting a game and that just shines lights on what you're hiding behind the walls of the stadium a lot more. But at the same time, as Rakshan mentioned, there's a matter of relative coverage. So you as an average person are more likely to know about something that's happening in the sports arena, just because that has much of a cultural reach, than something that's happening in news media. And that's why you can see Saudi Arabia like investing so heavily in the process of sports washing, because it's a lot easier to distract people's attention away from something like the Jamal Khashoggi case than try to cover that up as completely from international media, because they already did as much as they could to hide that case, and still it came out. Al Jazeera reported on it, all the major news media outlets reported on it and continue to report on it even as they were hosting these games. But ultimately, news media does not have the same coverage in the present context as sports does. Sports is a lot more widely watched. I'm pretty sure, I don't have the exact figures for it, but there's a much larger population watching something like the Olympic Games or the World Cup, for example, than somebody watching BBC. So something like these specific human rights abuses that these nations commit, they may not be able to hide them from the eyes of journalists, from the eyes of politicians across the world, but they'll definitely be able to hide it from the eyes of the general public. And for them, that's what matters, because that's what brings in them money and that's what maintains their international reputation. Because ultimately, politicians can also be bought with their money that these authoritarian nations have. And as for the news media, once there's a new scandal, ultimately they will move on to the next big human rights abuse that has been committed. So these nations don't need to worry as much about the coverage of their human rights abuses in the news media as much as they need to worry about how it's actually reaching the general population, which they can avoid by investing in something like sports washing. Yeah.
To sort of conclude our discussion, I thought it would be interesting to talk about why sports washing works so well. We don't see the same thing happening with pop culture, with movies or singers or music in the same way. And the practice isn't necessarily subtle, right? We've talked about the protests that surround a lot of these games, even including the last Olympics. So what explains why sports washing has managed to continue, and also how well the countries have managed to control and shape these conversations to move on to these sports, right? And why do people continue to consume these games and these leagues and these tournaments, despite the fact that up till the point they start, the protests and the conversations on human rights sort of like monopolize the media, right? And I think it would be interesting to also talk about, if you watch sports, what specifically about sports you think you connect with, and why do you think sports is different?
Yeah, Rakshan, go ahead.
Like I mentioned, sports is a very emotional thing for people. It's, if I'm talking just specifically about the Premier League, let's for that matter, it's not just about a particular team they support. They're supporting the team of their community, right? Each sports team comes from a particular city, and it's very personal for everyone from that city that, okay, fine, we are investing a lot of time in it and we are investing a lot of money in it. So we would like them to see, and at the end of the day, after a hard day's worth of work, we want to see some fun. It's an entertainment of sort, right? And why is sports washing working so well is about abusing this emotion. If you look into all the teams that have been bought in the recent past, they're actually the teams that have not been doing well historically, right? Manchester City was not a big team. It was a team that was relegated. It is a team that has never won. Newcastle has never won anything. Chelsea has never won anything before Abramovich came in. Paris was not a big team before it was bought in by Qatar. So these are teams that have not really done well, but have a huge following. Newcastle at this very moment has a very big following in the city. And the fact that they've never won and they see new owners coming in, buying the team with so much money and investing so much, changes everything for them. The best example is the Manchester City team being bought. A year before that, they were threatened by relegation. And a year after that, they won the Premier League. It's because the owners invested $2 billion into a fan base who were desperate to see their team win. And the abusing of that power is why sports washing works so well. We saw that happening with Paris. They bought in Messi, they bought in Neymar, they bought in Mbappe, all big money. It was not a big team before that. Same with Newcastle right now, and we will see the same thing with Newcastle. We saw it happening with Chelsea. Chelsea, for that matter, won 2 back-to-back Premier Leagues a year after Roman Abramovich bought in the team. Just that year. That's the difference big money can bring in. You're talking about millions and millions of followers, right? And it kind of, like I said, it kind of puts pressure on the administration as well. They're like, fine, we cannot really talk about these authoritarian regimes or of these bullish leaders. It's because our own community members care very deeply for these teams. And if these people are doing well for our community members, talking about them will jeopardize my position politically. So that's the thinking that politicians also come from, that they're like, fine, let them just go on. It doesn't really matter. It's not my country. The abuse is happening. So as long as my people are happy, that's what matters to me. So it's the abuse of that emotional aspect of sports is why sports washing has been worked so well. And the fact that it's been very cleverly researched and the kind of teams that are bought in, it works. They didn't really buy in Manchester United. They didn't buy in Liverpool. They bought in the lower league teams, which not really have worked historically. That's the way to go about sports washing.
Yeah, no, I
Yeah,
definitely,
Nachiket.
I
Okay.
definitely agree. There's a lot of emotional aspect, especially to sports. Nachiket, do you want to continue?
Yeah, so building on what Rakshan said, it got me into thinking how these funders tap into the idea of territoriality in some ways, because you see there's a nationalistic feeling going on when we play at a greater level sports in FIFA or in World Cup or even national cricket teams play, but these have the idea of sub-nationalism, and it's very intriguing how these funders and these clubs tap onto that idea and feeling of sub-nationalism. And moving on, I also think that if we were to look at examples of why not just in authoritarian regimes but in democracies these emotions play out really well when the motives are more or less similar. So it brings to the case of 2012 UK when the Olympics were held in London. So the argument was we need a global rebranding of UK, and we need to clean up the streets, and we need to boost tourism. So these are the things that citizens really buy in really well, even if they care little about sports. So these factors also play about apart from pro sports, and they complement and even supplement sometimes sports. So even beyond that idea of sports, these feelings of nationalism, pride, subnationalism, territoriality, geography, association with each other, or small scale like rivalries, like this state is a rival with that, healthy competition. So these all things really play out really well, both in democracies and authoritarian regimes. So I just wanted to mention that because we must not overlook that if we need to, more probe more into this concept of sports washing.
No, I definitely agree with both of you. And I sort of also wanted to build on that point a little bit. But I think it's also the routine of sports. You wear the same thing for these matches. You eat the same thing. You come together with like a group of people, and you'll all watch it together, in a sort of similar way. And there's a routine and regularity to it. But also the way sports washing has been done is they've really managed to separate the the politics from the sports. When you buy the tickets and you go to this country to watch a football match, for example, you're not thinking of the politics of the country. You're specifically there to watch the football match. They managed to do that really well. So I think now we'll take concluding remarks. If you have anything to add.
Personally, I would say I'm from Bangalore, so I've seen my cricket team here lose year after year in the IPL. And if for that matter, someone does come in and says like, listen, I'm going to make sure that you win, I would not really care about what their human rights record is, what they have done. I'll be like, yeah, I need that trophy. I've had enough insults over the last 12, 13 years to ensure that I really, really need Royal Challengers Bangalore to win. So that's a sentiment that one can tap into and not look at any other aspect. I'm like, fine, as long as my team wins, that's what matters for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say the same. My loyalty to a team goes beyond my understanding of politics, despite the fact that I am an international relations student and I actively comment on these issues. I might still take a ticket to the Qatar World Cup because it's very close to where I live. So I think it's just, yeah, it's like Wynnona mentioned, the fact that sports is something that is designed to unite people across borders and kind of erase the idea of, a single like specific nation or a specific nation state. It's more about the fans from all over the world coming together for some player that they like. So anything that preys on something like this need for unity is inherently dangerous, which is why sports washing is so dangerous and also so effective. And it, as I think Rakshan mentioned in an earlier point, when you're a sports regulator, you have to take things like this into consideration. When even if you're in a really difficult situation and you don't have many bidders, you should think about the specific nation that is bidding, whether you as a sports regulator should necessarily give that nation the right to host that sport, even if they have enough money, even if they have the resources that you will need. Is that something that is worth doing for the sake of the sport, if it is being used in a way that is perverse to the very principle of the sport itself, which is that it unites people? But if you're giving that power in the hands of someone that pretty much takes pride in violating those principles, as a sports regulator, you have to think about those things when you decide to host a sports event. Yeah.
I think with this we've come to an end to this roundtable. Thank you everyone for joining. This was a really relevant and interesting topic to discuss, and honestly, you don't really hear about it much often. So this was a really interesting roundtable. I hope to see you around, and happy Diwali, everyone.